This is the official podcast of the G20 Interfaith Forum, where we discuss the key events, the goals, and the focus of the organization. Welcome to another episode of the G20 Interfaith Forum podcast. My name is Stuart Bird.
I'm Marianna Richardson.
And today we are honored to be joined by Dr. Charles McNeill. Dr. McNeill, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Dr. McNeill is the founder of the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative.
So, Dr. McNeill, I would love for you to just give a brief description of your background and experience. I know in terms of the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, we have had some wonderful opportunities to work together with the IF20, but I would love for people to get to know you a little bit better as we start this discussion.
Great. Well, thank you. I grew up in California and in British Columbia, and I had the privilege of really experiencing a healthy, vital, natural world. And I grew up thinking that's really the birthright of all people, and that really gave rise to my career on environmental issues. I studied conservation of natural resources at UC Berkeley. I studied plant genetics and evolutionary biology and conservation biology at UC Davis. And then I started to work for the UN in 1992. My first assignment was to support the Rio Earth Summit. And out of that summit came two important conventions, one on climate change and one on biodiversity. And my subsequent 30 years with the UN are really about implementing those conventions. And in 2006, I realized that protecting tropical forest was actually key to achieving the goals of those two conventions, as well as the goals of the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, that we can't actually make progress without tropical forests. And I realized very few people seem to pay attention to that issue. So I really devoted my last 20 years to this topic. And my last assignment at the UN, starting in 2017, was very unexpected. I was asked to explore the premise that perhaps by engaging with faith communities and religious leaders, that we might be able to make progress that we have not been able to make so far. And so the Norwegian government reached out to the UN and to me and said, we just can't solve these problems without engaging religious leaders, and please help us explore that. So that inspired the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative. And in fact, our efforts were very much inspired by Pope Francis, Laudato Si. And so that body of work has really led to a very exciting future, which I didn't expect.
Thank you for giving us some insight on those experiences and those organizations that you've worked with and that you've founded. I would love for you to shed some light on how important are tropical rainforests for citizens around the world in terms of protecting our climate, biodiversity, and agriculture.
Yes, and let's start by defining these terms. That technically tropical forests are those forests located near the equator in the tropics. And they're a broader category than rainforests, which are really focused on high rainfall areas. But tropical forests also include some dry forests. But for the purposes of this discussion, it's fine to use them interchangeably, tropical forests and rainforests. They're mostly overlapping. And really, to answer your question, I have to step back and look at the climate situation. And this, just a few words about this. The climate crisis is already severe and it's getting worse. And tragically, we're on track to blow through the 1.5 degree warming goal set in Paris and that we've had our eye on for years. And the Secretary General of the United Nations just last week said, let's recognize our failure. The truth is, we've failed to avoid overshooting 1.5 degrees in these next few years, and that going above 1.5 degrees has devastating consequences. Some of them could be tipping points, be in the Amazon or in Greenland, Western Antarctica, or coral reefs. So the Secretary General has his eye on this agenda as well. And we're seeing, as we all know, extreme weather events, intensified heat waves, droughts, floods, wildfires, all of this is becoming more severe. And we're headed towards breaking through the 2-degree threshold by mid-century. And so without urgent action, we're also headed to even 3 degrees, which is absolutely inconceivable. The catastrophic consequences for human society and planetary system is just hard to get our head around. And so we really need to increase our efforts to reduce emissions, to remove carbon, to increase resilience. The World Bank, for example, estimates that climate change could push an additional 130 million people into extreme poverty just by the end of 2030. And so the impacts goes on and on. And so we want to ask the question, what proportion of the greenhouse gases that are driving this climate crisis are caused by tropical forest loss and degradation? And the answer is about 10 to 15% of all those emissions are coming from tropical forest destruction. And without addressing this source of emissions, there's really no way to meet those Paris Agreement's targets. So it's really a key piece of the puzzle. And encouragingly and really amazingly, by safeguarding and restoring these forests, this could contribute up to 30% of the solution needed to keep global warming within the 2-degree range. So it's both a cause, but it's a huge potential solution of this climate crisis. And let's not forget that tropical forests influence global and regional weather patterns, determine rainfall distribution, and so are crucial for agriculture and water supply all over the world. And then with regard to biodiversity, you ask about that. The tropical forests are incredibly rich in biodiversity. They're home to about 50% of all the world's plant species. Imagine that. And about 50% of all the world's animals. And then another topic that you raised and that I know the G20 Interfaith Forum is very committed to are the Sustainable Development Goals. And it just so happens that by addressing deforestation and fostering sustainable forest management, we can make significant progress on many of the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs 1, 2, and 3 on poverty, hunger, and health are all advanced when you protect forests. The SDGs 13, 14, and 15 on climate, water, and land also are dependent on progress on tropical deforestation stopping and many others. So I focus on this topic of tropical forests because they're so key to climate, to biodiversity, to agriculture, to human rights, and they're fundamental to almost all the SDGs.
Thank you for that explanation. And especially, I think of our time last year, we were in Brazil, G20 was in Brazil. And so we had one of our meetings was in Belém, specifically talking about the concern over the Amazon and what's happening there. And that kind of goes into my next question in terms of, what are the causes of deforestation? One of the things that we did while we were there in Brazil is we talked a lot about the agroforestry that they're trying to do there in the Amazon. And we actually became a part of one of the major agroforesters there in terms of supplying trees and trying to help them with that. But I would love to have you talk a little bit about what still needs to be done and what also the major causes of some of this deforestation.
Great. Well, thank you. And I'm so glad you had that experience in Brazil. I too have had a lot of important learning experiences in Brazil. Brazil is just an incredibly important country. It's about 60% of the Amazon in Brazil, a huge proportion of all the world's tropical forests. And it's an exciting situation now. And just next week, the COP30 will be taking place there. And overall, I'd say that the situation of deforestation is still dire, although there's some positive trends in terms of protection. Many countries, international organizations, NGOs, particularly indigenous groups, and even businesses are taking effective action. The main drivers of deforestation are agricultural expansion, the conversion of forests into agricultural land for crops, especially beef, soy, palm. Amazingly, up to 90% of the deforestation of Brazil's Amazon is due to cattle and beef. And what's so tragic about this is that none of this is necessary. We have all the resources to feed the world's population, all the calories and nutrients they need without deforesting tropical forests. So that needs to be a focus. Logging is also a cause, unsustainable and illegal logging, and infrastructure development. That is roads, dams, urban expansion. And increasingly, I've been paying attention to the issue of illegal gold mining. I've seen that driving deforestation and poisoning of the populations with mercury all over the Amazon. So these are some of the major drivers. Just last month, the Eat Lancet report was launched. It's a Eat Lancet report 2.0, and they show that it's really a failing food system that's driving forest loss. And it's pushing us through 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries that really define a stable system in the world. These boundaries represent critical thresholds in the Earth systems that have to be maintained to ensure a stable climate. And this food system is driving, tipping the planetary boundaries of climate change, biodiversity loss, biogeochemical flows, ocean acidification, land system change, and freshwater use. All of these systems that all of life depends on are being pushed to the edge by a food system which needs to be transformed. We need to urgently shift to eating more plants and fewer animals. We have to reduce the tremendous amount of food waste and loss, and we have to increase sustainability and efficiency of food production. So just and looking at what's happened in the last 25 years since 2000, the annual rate of tropical forest loss has decreased slightly. From the year 2000 to 2010, we were losing about 13.4 million hectares per year. That's about the size of the country of Greece. Just to give you a sense, every year the size of a country of Greece was being deforested. Now, fortunately, that got reduced down to 11.5 million in the 2011 to 2020. And then in the more recent years, it's been reduced down further. But despite this progress, we're losing large areas of tropical forest, and the rate is not on track to meet global goals. And the decrease, it'd be interesting to look at the decrease. The decrease that we've seen is due to a combination of enhanced policies, international initiatives, increased awareness, corporate responsibility, which has been encouraging. Technological advancements have been helpful, and particularly the involvement of communities and empowering Indigenous peoples. These factors together have allowed us to decrease the deforestation rate over these years. And most interestingly, you raised Brazil. Between 2004 and 2012, Brazil was able to decrease their deforestation rate by 80%. And since President Lula has returned for a second term, in just the last year and a half, they've managed to reduce their deforestation rate, which had increased dramatically under the former president. They've decreased it now in just a year and a half by 50%. So it can be done. And they did it by enforcing the law, by creating protected areas and empowering indigenous peoples, by having supply chain interventions like what's called a soy moratorium to prevent selling of soy that was on recently deforested land. Beef supplies been managed better, financing mechanisms, engagement with civil society and business. So there's a track record. This can be done, and Brazil provides one of the most dramatic examples of a winning potential. And we have to remember that forest protection is essential, but now we've done so much damage, we also have to focus on restoration. And above all, we need to educate and activate citizens everywhere. So that's why engaging faith communities is so key. It's really the golden key, as I see, to making a real difference.
I appreciate, Dr. McNeill, your expert view on hope and what is being done and what's working. And you mentioned as one of the things that's working is the involvement of indigenous communities. We know that you have centered much of your research on the roles of indigenous peoples, and that you recently uh, released a paper titled "The Critical Role of Indigenous Peoples in Addressing the Twin Crises of Climate Change and Loss of Nature: How Powerful New Partnerships Between Indigenous Peoples, Faith Communities, and Science to Protect Forests Can Turn the Tide."
A
What
long title.
inspired you? Yeah, that's a wonderful title. And it's inspiring to hear all the work you've done. What led you to focus your research and to promote the contribution of indigenous peoples in addressing these climate change issues?
Many years ago, I traveled deep into the Amazon. In fact, it was the Brazilian Amazon. And I spent several weeks in an indigenous community, and I learned firsthand how these indigenous leaders and community members have taken personally and collective responsibility for protecting those forests. It's really just palpable. It was so clear they were living their lives in order to protect these forests, not only for their own purposes, but on behalf of the entire human family and all species around the world. And I've seen that all over the world where I've been with indigenous peoples. I've realized they've taken responsibility for these forests. Their ways of life, their spirituality, their world vision has all to do with respect for nature and a sustainable management of nature. I was astonished. And I also came to understand that these indigenous peoples are the most effective stewards of these forests. They're managing vast amounts of land that are critical for biodiversity conservation and climate stability. They have deep-rooted understanding and knowledge uh, developed over thousands of years. And interestingly, a growing body of research and evidence has shown very clearly that indigenous managed lands have lower rates of deforestation, higher biodiversity, reduced greenhouse gas emissions compared to all other land uses. This is really unmistakable. And in spite of that, they're facing threats to their lives and livelihoods. There have been, many of the environmental defenders that are tracked by Global Witness every year. Most of those deaths that are done, that are these tragic killings, are of indigenous peoples. Their land rights are being violated by governments and companies that encroach on their lands for agriculture, mining, and logging. There's all kinds of threats. And what we're seeing is that the most important thing for the indigenous peoples and for the results that we need for the global community is to give rights, to protect their rights. And so in my work, I've just realized that one of the most effective and important things that could possibly be done is to invest in protecting the rights of indigenous people so they can do what they want to do, which is in the interest of all of us. Um, and 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 I've really, over these 30 years with the UN, one of the most encouraging developments that I've seen is how this understanding of the importance of indigenous knowledge, culture, ways of life, and spirituality, understanding of how important this is, and there's been growing resources allocated, growing partnership over these 3 decades, growing visibility to the importance of this struggle. And the indigenous peoples have been collaborating with scientists, with the United Nations, with NGOs, with philanthropies, with governments, and most recently with religious leaders and faith communities. And that's been one of the most exciting aspects of my work in recent years. And so this development, this empowerment of indigenous peoples is, in my view, one of the most hopeful and game-changing movements that give us some hope in dealing with the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis in today's world.
Well, and last year when we were in Brazil, we also had a meeting in Manaus where we talked specifically to the indigenous people. And one thing that really impressed me was the fact that their religion and their spirituality, as you've already mentioned, is very much connected to the land and connected to nature. And one of the things that you've already alluded to, especially with the IRI, is this idea of interfaith and how interfaith, especially people of faith, individuals, but also religions, can help in this important work. I was wondering if you could also talk about and address how interfaith collaboration can improve tropical forests.
Yes. You know, when I first got that call from the Norwegian government saying, hey, let's explore how we can collaborate with faiths, I realized even then that religious leaders have moral authority, they have political inputs, they have access to financial resources, and that the potential of them being powerful advocates for these issues just seemed far-reaching. But what surprised me was how easy and almost effortless it was engaging with faith leaders, how natural and effective it was in terms of them taking on these issues, because the sanctity of life um, and the sort of respect for nature are core to the core uh, tenets, the core beliefs, the core uh, documents of almost every faith. And so it's been really gratifying to see what a natural uptake that was just by sharing the facts of tropical forests, indigenous people's rights, and climate change, how religious leaders have got on board and taken on this issue for themselves. I've also been really impressed by the G20 Interfaith Forum contribution, the publishing of a number of policy papers and recommendations and background notes. Catherine Marshall of Georgetown University and many of you have done an amazing job that I've been so grateful from the UN perspective to see this proliferation of thinking and action and analysis. There have been papers from 2019, 2020, 2022, 2024. So I've been really encouraged by the work there. And then secondly, the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, which, as I said, was founded in 2017, inspired by Pope Francis. We work together with some important interfaith groups that you surely all know: Green Faith, the Parliament of the World's Religions, Religions for Peace, the World Council of Churches, the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, together with an NGO called Rainforest Foundation Norway, the UN Environment Programme, the UN Development Programme that I spent 30 years with, and the government of Norway. Audrey Kantigawa with the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation has also been very supportive. So this foundation, this platform, has allowed us to work in the 5 countries that hold 70% of the world's remaining tropical forests. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, that just 5 countries hold more than 70% of all the world's tropical forests, and those are Brazil, we've talked about, Colombia, Peru, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative is a platform for religious leaders to work hand in hand with indigenous peoples, scientists, civil society, and governments on actions to protect rainforests and the rights of indigenous peoples. I could talk for a long time about all the exciting work that's happened in these 5 countries. And just to say in a few words that each of these countries have developed training materials to train thousands of religious leaders who have then trained, educated millions of their constituents. There have been local chapters established where the deforestation is highest and where the threats to indigenous peoples are greatest, and these local chapters have been effective. There's been a focus on national legislation and impacting the way governments deal with these issues, and communications campaigns through radio and television, print, and others. And as a result, in these 5 countries, there have been a number of exciting developments. Some legislation has passed in Democratic Republic of Congo to protect indigenous peoples. In Brazil, religious leaders are undergoing a 3-day intense immersive training in the science of climate and biodiversity. And in Colombia, local chapters have been opened up throughout the country and have been effective. In Indonesia, fatwas, which are Quran-based declarations, have been issued to combat climate change. And in Peru, national legislation to protect environmental defenders have been instituted. So there's been a lot of exciting work that's gone on. And perhaps the most exciting, the most encouraging development of all has been I've seen a kind of a healing of the historically broken relationship since colonization between the major Western religions and indigenous peoples, that they're healing that relationship. They're working together in the most inspiring and encouraging way.
Well, I love hearing about all that has been done and what is being done in terms of interfaith collaboration with climate action. What do you see as the future of interfaith climate action?
I see several things. One is that the interfaith groups need to follow up and be successful with the initiatives like IRI that have started. And it could be that the methodology and experience that we've developed in tropical regions of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, that perhaps that methodology could apply to other geographies and to other issues. That, as I mentioned, tropical forest is a piece of the climate, puzzle that needs to be in place. But we also have to pay attention to the huge drivers, which is energy, transportation, industrial production, buildings, and others. So putting attention on these issues, interfaith efforts on these issues is important. And above all, nothing more important than advocating for the phasing out of fossil fuels. So I would hope and pray that interfaith and faith actors can really take on the fossil fuel tragedy that we have to phase out. We have no future without phasing out fossil fuels. And then the last thing is really an interesting development that I've noticed recently, and that is that when we launched IRI, the idea was, to bring the moral authority and the reach and the influence of religions to this tropical forest fight. But alongside deforestation and even driving this crisis, we noticed another force, and that is the propagation of climate misinformation and disinformation, and the deepening polarization and the erosion of public trust in science and policy that's happened. And it's everywhere, flooding channels of communication, hardening divides, making it harder for citizens everywhere to understand and to act decisively to protect forests. So what we're looking at and understanding now is that the faith leaders are uniquely positioned to help push back against disinformation and misinformation and polarization and to build bridges. I really envision that role for faiths and interfaith coalitions to really counteract this destructive disinformation that's happening around, that I see enormous potential there.
No, thank you for bringing that up in terms of misinformation and disinformation. I know we've also been talking a lot about the influence of AI, artificial intelligence, and LLMs in terms of kind of propagating this whole concept of misinformation and disinformation, especially in the youth, that oftentimes are not critical in terms of the information that they find through, asking what artificial intelligence will tell them about these crucial topics.
Yes.
You mentioned previously about the COP30, which is going to be happening very soon, and the climate conference in Belém, Brazil. It starts next week, and I would love to hear your thoughts and feelings about it. I think it's been interesting. There's been some controversy about just even having it there in Belém, and that Belém isn't very big, and so they've had to take down forests to be able to have places for people to stay. I mean, there's been a lot of climate controversy with this COP, and I would love to have your thoughts and feelings about it.
Yes. Well, it's incredibly important. It's the first COP ever held in the Amazon. And so tropical forests and indigenous peoples are being prioritized and featured in a very significant way. The sort of organizational logistical issues you raise about a relatively small city hosting the whole world has generated some problems and some challenges, but I'm looking to Belen to actually make some real progress. In one of the major initiatives there is being proposed by the government of Brazil with support from many countries around the world is the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, which aims to raise $125 billion for protection and for ensuring standing forests. And interestingly, 20% of the funds will go directly to indigenous communities. So that's a real innovation. In just last week, the Secretary General was interviewed by an indigenous journalist and really emphasized the essential importance of indigenous voices at COP30. And in fact, I've understood from the Minister of, of Environment and Climate from Brazil that there'll be 10,000 or so, many thousands of indigenous peoples from all over, which is incredibly important. Um, and uh, and in terms of priorities for COP30, keeping the progress from the previous COPs, that there really needs to be an increased level of ambition. The nationally determined contribution NDCs just don't add up. They give us, if every country does what they already promised, we're still headed towards a 2.5-degree future. That can't stand, and only a third of the countries have so far issued a new plan. So they need to get with it, bring plans, more ambitious plans, and that's a key part. Also, action on the sort of what's called the climate nature axis, and that is taking action on nature to protect climate. And the most obvious example of that is halting deforestation. So they need to really advance the efforts to halt deforestation by 2030 through funding mechanisms and other ways. Climate finance needs to be scaled up, particularly for adaptation. That's a promise that hasn't been kept. It needs to be kept. And there needs to be a strengthening of the multilateralism and trust, because especially in these days where international cooperation has been eroded, there's, it's at an all-time low in many ways, that it needs to really refurbish and recommit ourselves to international cooperation. The food system, as I mentioned, the food system is now, encouragingly, the food system has been integrated into the climate challenge, and there needs a lot more attention on transforming our food system. So in summary, it's got to close the emissions gap, scale up finance, halt deforestation, and support vulnerable communities and countries, and bring global cooperation to a whole new level. All of that's required to even have a chance of meeting that 2-degree goal, or to even bring that 1.5-degree back into play. We've got a lot of work to do, but I'm counting on Belen being a critical step in the right direction.
I did want to add just one extra question, because we've talked about Indigenous people, we've talked about interfaith, but one group we really haven't talked about is the youth. As I think about these kinds of thoughts that we're talking about, we're really talking about the future, and that the youth really need to be involved in terms of understanding what their future is going to be like. And I was just curious about your thoughts on involving youth more in these really important things that have to do with their lives and their futures.
100%. I couldn't agree more. And when I see these hopeful developments in reducing tropical deforestation, it's often women and youth, indigenous leaders, where you've seen the most traction and the most vitality and the most powerful communications and the most effective activism. So I'm convinced and clear that the future is both by and for the youth, and that any investment in educating youth and in bringing them into these policy fora and giving them voice is worth its weight in gold. That I'm so glad you raised that question, raised that point, because I can see no more important priority for the coming years than to give the youth agency and access to the levers and dials that will determine their own future. So I'm fully on board with that, and think that that'll make or break our future.
Thank you so much, Dr. McNeill, for joining us. We've so appreciated it.
My great pleasure and honor.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of the G20 Interfaith Forum podcast.
The podcast provides information and discussions on the G20 Interfaith Forum, but the views expressed are those of the individuals involved and not necessarily the official stance of the forum.
The content is for general informational purposes only and should not be considered professional advice or expert recommendations. Listeners should exercise personal responsibility, seek professional guidance, and conduct further research when making decisions based on the podcast.
The information shared may not always reflect the most current developments, and external links or resources are provided for additional information but are not endorsed or controlled by the podcast.
By listening to the podcast, listeners acknowledge and accept these disclaimers. Please be aware that the content of this podcast may be subject to copyright. Unauthorized copy, distribution, and reproduction of any part of the podcast is prohibited.